Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Breakout Session B4. Just make sure you're in the right place if this is where you want to be. So this is carbon farming, best practices in regenerative agriculture, and how to be transparent about your sourcing and agricultural practices. We'll give it just a moment. I see some people are still trickling in, but just make sure you're in the right session here. All right. So I am pleased to announce our moderator for today's session, Kathleen Finley, who is president of the Glenwood Center in Cold Spring, New York.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session. My name is Kathleen Finley, and I am the president of the Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming, which is in the Hudson Valley. And I also founded Pleiades, which is a network of women leaders nationally that sustainability. So we're going to be talking today a little bit about the production of food. And I'm delighted we're here this year because as the industry has made great strides in thinking about health and prioritizing health and nutrition in terms of operations and what's on the menu, I think that there's opportunity to think beyond that plate or the kitchen and really think about how the food that you're serving and procuring is produced and how it fosters or hinders a progress toward a more sustainable future environmentally, in terms of our health, and even social issues and economic issues. So the work at Glenwood is about supporting and fostering a regional food system, and we do that by training farmers and building coalitions of producers so that we can advance decentralized, sustainable food system in our region. And hopefully that region, the work that we do in our region in the Hudson Valley, hopefully inspires other folks in this country and beyond about how to move away from a homogenized conventional system into a more decentralized, sustainable food system. And the organizers have assembled a fantastic crew of experts that I think will go a long way to inspire and inform you about how you can take into your practice and your operations some of the best practices and best methods we have for producing healthy and sustainable food. So we will be hearing from three folks. I'll introduce them one at a time. Each of them are going to share a little bit about their work, and then we'll invite them all on for a moderated discussion, and I'll be looking at the question chat box if you have questions for these awesome panelists. So first up is Mike Ham. Mike is a professor of sustainable agriculture and a senior fellow at the Center for Regional Food Systems at Michigan State. And Mike is really an expert on regenerative agriculture. He brings great insights into how we can produce food in a way that is healthy for us and healthy for our environment. Mike, it is a delight to have you here today, and thanks for sharing your work with us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it very much, and thanks for having me. And welcome to everybody out there, wherever you're hailing from. So let's get into it since I have 5 minutes. If I could have the next slide, please. So I thought I'd start with simply what is regenerative agriculture, and using Regenerative International definition is probably as good as it gets. So regenerative agriculture we can think of as describing farming and grazing practices that, among other benefits, reverse climate change by rebuilding soil organic matter and restoring degraded soil and soil biodiversity, resulting in both carbon drawdown and improving the water cycle. And improving the water cycle is also a really important part of it, given the changes we're going to see in water and water cycles with climate change. Next slide, please. And so what I'm going to do in the next 5 minutes is simply talk briefly about two examples. One is ruminant production strategies, and the other is row crop production. And we'll leave it at that for now and maybe talk about a bit more during the Q&A. Next slide, please. So this is some work done by my colleague, Jason Roundtree, in our Department of Animal Sciences here at Michigan State, and by his graduate student at the time, Paige Stanley, looking at the potential for intensively managed rotational grazing or adapted mob grazing, as it's also called, in looking at carbon fluxes in the production of ruminant animals. Of course, ruminant animals are considered one of the key producers of greenhouse gases. And so looking at ways to both possibly reduce our overall meat consumption, but recognizing that meat is a part of many cultures, our diets, and provides a lot of health benefits if consumed appropriately, how we might do it better. So click, please. So if we start looking at feedlot raised beef, for many of you who may not know, beef is often raised up to about 700 pounds on pastures and grazing lands and stuff around the country. But then the final up to 500 or 600 pounds, the final 500 or 600 pounds is usually done in a feedlot. And if we look at the soil carbon release, mostly in the form of methane through belching and farting, what we see is that without looking at soil carbon flux, there's a certain amount of release of carbon. Click, please. If we take into account the carbon flux in the lands where those cattle are feedlotted and where the grain is produced to feed them, we see that it's virtually the same. There's no carbon absorbed by the soil. There's not that much released by the soil. Next click, please. If we then look at intensively managed rotational grazing, what we see is that without considering soil carbon flux, there's actually more methane produced in those animals than there is in feedlot based. And this is because of the quality of the diet, basically, and the fact that the carbon nitrogen ratio is not quite necessarily exactly right, and other reasons. Click, please. But if we incorporate looking at soil carbon flux, and this is based on measurements at the 40-acre research farm that Jason has his herd at, what we see is, in fact, in the adaptive mob grazing or the intensively managed rotational grazing system, there is a large amount of carbon sequestration by the soil, such that it more than compensates for everything that's released by the cows. So in an AMP or an IMG beef system, in fact, what we get is a net carbon sequestration in the production of those beef cows, whereas in the feedlot raised, we get a net release. Next slide, please. So that type of production of beef cattle can in fact be part of the solution. Now, the question is, how do we do that along large expanses of land? Well, there's a lot of work being done right now on virtual fencing, using radio collars and GPS and computer control to keep the animals where you want them and move them rotationally. Next slide, please. And just shortly to say is that the other advantage to pasture from a standpoint of pesticide use is just normal pesticide use across soybeans and corn, which is the primary feed ingredients, is much, much higher than that in pasture. An average of, say, 2 to 3 pounds per acre total in a year versus 0.08 pounds per acre in a year. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. And then very quickly, if we look at row crop production, this is a study from the Rodale Institute in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, in their farming systems trial. And very quickly, what they found over a 15-year period is that in their 2 organic systems, one in which manure was the primary nutrient source, one in which legume production in a rotational cropping system was, what we find is a net carbon sequestration in the soil over that 15 years versus the conventional system in which there was no net carbon sequestration. So again, in a different kind of system, but using row crops in this case, which we need some of, even if we're not using it to raise beef, we can develop a system which in fact can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Next slide, please. And on that note, I'll end with a nice picture of my grandmother. One picture when she's 94, then 104, and the final one with the beer in her hand on the right is when she's 110. And I'll leave it go at that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike, for sharing that really important information about how we produce food and how it can address the climate crisis, among other things. My pleasure now to introduce Mai Wen. Mai is a farmer and a social justice activist. She is the co-director of Minnow, which is focused on land tenure for farmers of color. Mai has really been a leader in helping the food movement have a stronger and more inclusive voice, and we are delighted to have them here today to share their thoughts and experiences, especially right now. just waiting for Mai to come online. Not quite seeing her yet. There you are. Hi, Mai. Take it away.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yeah, in our short time together, I want to unpack the component parts of regeneration. As a farmer, I regularly witness regeneration through pruned trees, patching their amputations, healing lost tails, and new skin emerging under my callus. And this kind of regeneration keeps us alive as we are, but does not deeply transform us. And given the radical transformation needed to heal our gutted, heating planet, such that future generations inherit a bounteous earth, we must embark on a regenerative process that includes restoration and repair. So on restoration, a resilient ecosystem relies on biodiversity, and we have lost 96% of our seed diversity only in the past 150 years. The world we need cannot settle with us regenerating the remaining 4%. We need to restore the 96%. On my farm, I'm restoring over 20 different varieties of rare wheat among the 1,000 known varieties, and they capture 4 to 6 times more carbon than modern varieties. But it takes me nearly a decade to grow a small packet of stowaway seeds into what you may use in a. This restoration effort requires concerted resourcing to save seed, build appropriate equipment and facilities, and to connect with millers, chefs, and bakers who also want to contribute to this effort. So restoration takes resources, and now is already too late, but better than tomorrow. So restoration not only of seeds, but also of knowledge and traditions that stewarded biodiversity. The loss of our global seed treasure correlates with colonialism. Regional crops were privatized and replaced by monocultures to supply the colonizing empire, led other colonies to cripple their independence and economies. Colonialism eradicated crops, diversity, cultures, and human beings, the people who held the knowledge and traditions of ecological stewardship, harvest, food, and regeneration. But not all is lost. Just are bearers of ancient cultural culinary traditions, Indigenous, Black, and people of color exercise farming and land stewardship traditions every day. Indigenous people, percent of the world's biodiversity, while inhabiting only 20% of our land mass. They, as their rights, lives, livelihoods, are threatened by colonizers and corporations, whose violence has caused Indigenous people to die from COVID faster than anyone else. Indigenous and Black farmers in the US have been growing our food since before the founding of this country, and they are still here. Immigrants and people of color provide us food every day, even though they have not been justly compensated or face robbery, hazardous conditions, and deportations. Farm workers are among the highest hit by COVID, and we need farmers, especially Black, Indigenous, and farmers of color. We need to be recognized for more than our essential work, but also our personhood. Fewer than 2% of US Americans are farmers, and our numbers are shrinking. Our society can decide to repair the wrongdoings towards Indigenous, Black, and people of color, according to what is owed and what is needed for us to thrive and exercise our regenerative ways to repair the damage done. So, in recalling the session's description, yes, we need to reimagine relationships with plants, animals, and soil. We too need to reimagine our relationships with each other. We must repair relationships with each other, repair the past, repair our institutions so that we have a state worth regenerating. And repair is done through reparation. So I hope you will engage with farmers and activists like me to aid in restoration and reparations that will benefit all of us and generations to come. Thank you.
Mai, thanks so much for that eloquent call to action and need for right now. Really appreciate that. I'm now going to welcome Anthony Mint to share his work with us. Anthony has been a restaurateur and a chef. He helped co-found Mission Chinese Food and Commonwealth Restaurants in the Bay Area. And he's now at the helm of Zero Foodprint, which he's going to tell us a little bit about, that helps restaurants engage with the climate crisis. And
thanks, Kathleen. And thank you to everybody for tuning in Menus of Change. We can go ahead. Zero Foodprint is a nonprofit that we run that is the recent winner of the James Beard Award for Humanitarian of the Year. And we're in public-private collaboration with the state of California, as well as beginning in Colorado with Boulder and Denver. And so I want to make the case that we're sort of at a moment where we need a new normal in the food system. So first I want to go really high level and just talk about the current state of affairs with food and climate. And basically, depending on where you draw the boundaries, if you include deforestation to produce food, if you include transportation, processing, managing food waste, everything that the whole food system includes, food is about half of all global emissions. And so, as we saw in Mike's presentation, as well as a growing body of research from biogeochemists and carbon farmers all around the world, there's really a big opportunity to not only reduce the emissions from the food system, but have it be a net positive to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so, as Mike was saying, really it comes down to sort of increasing the organic matter, the life, the biology, the worms, the mushrooms, the fungus, whatever it might be in the soil. And so, to use a simple analogy, like if you think about planting trees or something, that tree trunk is carbon that was in the atmosphere and has turned into a tree trunk. Likewise, if you cut down the tree, that will oxidize and decay and go back into the atmosphere as carbon. And so there's kind of that same zero-sum situation with soil. And let's go to the next slide. So this is kind of a quick numerical breakdown, kind of following Mike's path too, but at a global level. So this data comes from Drawdown, and it's basically showing, with regenerative agriculture and with managed grazing, just as two examples, there's the potential to take 20 billion tons of carbon out of the atmosphere. There's a cost, and there's a huge benefit. So that operational savings is experienced through water conservation, better nutrition, better flavor, crop security, many different basically challenges in the current food system would all be solved by better farming, basically farming with nature. The challenge that we have as a society is how to kind of change the current food system, to change the acres at a really rapid rate before it's too late. And so there's kind of a prevailing model, which is sort of which is a farm-to-table model. And we need this, and it's crucial. But our work is really centered around an alternative additional model, which I'll refer to as table to farm. And so we can go to the next slide. So currently, after 40 years, organic is about 2% of farmland. And so the model that we're working on in collaboration with governments is one of collective economic action. And basically, it's modeled after sort of like the same concepts as what is happening in renewable energy, which is to say, a consumer might pay $5 more per month on their bill. It's not really a big deal. Anybody can opt out. And then that allows like a whole city to basically improve the grid and transition to renewable energy in 5 years or 10 years or something like that. And so this is already underway in 100 cities, many different countries and states. But that model really only began in the last 5 or 10 years, like in 2014, I think. And so we have that same opportunity in food to basically envision farmland as one big solar panel with which we can improve the grid. Next slide. So at the moment, there's a bunch of restaurants leading this effort, some of the best chefs in the world in California. coming soon in Colorado, but it's also an effort that is being led by corporations. So at the moment, I'm working as part of a big accelerator with a bunch of companies like, Sodexo, Compass Group, Bon Appetit Management, Whole Foods, Google, etc., on how they can expedite this shift in the food system. So in a minute, I will also share a link to a slideshow, or I'm sorry, to a survey that would allow anyone here to participate and inform that process. I think that'll be it for now. I can answer questions in the Q&A and appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Really appreciate that very tangible action that you outlined. So I think now we'll invite all of the panelists to join. And I'll be looking at the chat box for any questions that we can ask these very smart folks. But meanwhile, I'll ask a couple of questions of my own. I would love to hear, all of you took a unique perspective on regeneration, right? Mike, you talked about sort of regenerative soil and farming, and you talked about sort of philosophically about regeneration in terms of our society right now. And Anthony, you talked about how we can use regenerative agriculture in the culinary sector. So we're not totally agnostic about what's going on around us. I wonder if you could share briefly how your work is being affected in this historical moment of both the social energy that's happening around the Black Lives Matter movement and the global pandemic. Talk to our audience about how this has perhaps catalyzed or hindered the work that you've been doing. And I think that we'll go in the same order. So Mike, Mai, and then Anthony. Mike, what's happening with you?
Okay, I was thinking on this one, I'd like to hear what they have to say first, but that's okay. I'll go first. It's interesting. I was struck with what Maya was talking about kind of regeneration of culture and regeneration of our souls and our relationships to each other. At least that's my words for it, I think. And I think one of the things that we've seen in the pandemic is the need for much greater flexibility and diversity in our supply chains and in our production. And I focus on regional and local food systems a lot. And I actually think the only way regional and local food systems are going to become a greater part of the food system and are going to help improve the resilience in our food system and the equity in it is for a large focus to be on new and emerging farmers, and that a large percentage of those farmers are people of color from various backgrounds. And that's not just in an urban farming context. I think it's also in a rural farming context where there's the land to really produce large amounts of food. So I think that the regeneration of land and the regeneration of people and the regeneration of cultures are intimately connected with each other, and I'll just leave it with that.
Great. Mai, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I guess just going back to your original question of, how has this moment sort of impacted our work? And people might have not seen my bio because there's tons of information floating around, but I have a background in climate science. I was a researcher for a long time. And then when I went into farming, I developed food hubs, regional food hubs, and specifically organized in the cooperative format so that the farmers are actually owners of their means of distribution. And also come from a background of prior to that food work I worked in disaster management for refugee camps, and then also from natural disasters, and was a logician. And then there's my work in racial justice. And so with the pandemic and then what's been happening in our whole cultural conversation, I just keep getting messages from my friends who are like, this is your moment. Everything, people are finally paying attention to the things that you've really dedicated your life to. And so there's it feels overwhelming and exciting to enable to talk to people who are now receptive, and to expand the infrastructure that I had been working on, right? So the work with small scale farmers of color who were already doing direct to consumer work, and just helping them expand in this time when there are more funders who are interested in that kind of model of regional food systems, right? But then with this particular focus on people of color, culturally relevant food, and making sure that that food goes directly to people who need it most, right? Not just the people who can afford a CSA or who already were privy to it, but connecting it to the people who have lost their jobs, who are already in precarious situations. So I think initially there was this kind of excitement to connect the dots between what people might have thought of as opaque or inaccessible. And now I think the worry is Amazon sales are still increasing, right? So are CSAs going to be a means for creating more secure local food systems in the face of these growing, tech-backed entities? Are essential workers really going to get rights? And with the new relief fund package introduced by the Senate, it looks, it's kind of pessimistic. But I think if people this moment of transformation and deep reflection, then there's hope.
Yeah, let's hope some of it sticks and regenerates and transforms. Anthony, we just have a couple minutes. Unfortunately, you're also interesting. I wish we had more time, but give us some of your thoughts about this moment right now.
Well, the restaurant industry is on life support. At the same time, I think consumers and chefs and restaurants all understand the need for basically collective action to make systemic change. And so I think it's the time to organize around new frameworks that really take advantage of the moment and not wanting to just go back to, the normal that was broken before, but to create a new food system. The good news about our work and actually the science is that literally 1% of global GDP is enough to solve climate change. 1% for a restaurant is enough to go carbon neutral and do your part and support regenerative agriculture, not just by buying good ingredients, but by actually helping farmers make those transitions and implement those practices. So literally anybody on this call can jump in and help lead this movement.
Yeah, great. Well, it's time for us to wrap, and I'm sure there's more. We didn't get a chance to ask too many questions, but I know all of you are open to connecting directly with folks. And I hope that leaves our audience feeling informed and empowered to help foster regenerative agriculture that then can help heal lots of things in our society. So thanks for tuning in, and good luck with all of your work.
Thank you all so much. Big thank you to our panelists. The networking break is about to get underway, and we're excited to share a short presentation with all of you with details on opportunities for networking and engaging with your colleagues during this time. So I'm sure there's a lot more engagement that you want to be had with these panelists. So be sure to do that. Thank you all so much for joining. And if you're new, especially, be sure to watch this presentation.